Okay, hello, welcome. We finally got down to it. We're starting a new series of proofs and evidence. We're going to be going through lots of different types of evidence for God's existence and for the divinity, the truth of the Torah, the divinity of the Torah and Judaism as a whole. But we have to start off with an absolutely critical, in my opinion, video explaining how to assess evidence and how to think, analyzing our thought processes. Because, as we're going to explain, there are many things which stop people accepting evidence, even if the evidence is true and accurate and compelling objectively, but people will still not accept it. So we're in this lecture, we're going to try getting ourselves aware of our minds and what we're looking for when we talk about evidence and proof, especially when it comes to these ideas, these sort of like big ideas of the truth of reality and the universe, etc., and religion. Okay, right, so what is truth and how do we get it? So we're going to come with the assumption that truth is an objective reality. There's a postmodern view that there isn't objective truth, that truth is a personal thing, but that's clearly really, it's anyone who's got a brain in their head will see that it's absolute rubbish. It's just an excuse to permit all sorts of corruptions and things like that. Yeah. I've got a hand. If someone says, well, my opinion is there's no hand here, then most rational thinking people will say that person's just, who cares about his opinion? His opinion just doesn't line up with the objective reality that there's a hand here. Just to throw that out at the start. So we believe there's an objective reality. If anyone's got any issues with that, I have to leave that to the comments. So we assume that everything has reality. The whole science is based on objective reality. There's laws of nature and things like that. So when we're going to speak about the truth of reality, we're talking about what lies behind what science tells us. And specifically, how do we know there's a creator behind everything? And then, once we establish, hopefully, that there is a creator, and what type of creator is it? Is it a conscious creator? Is it a creator which doesn't have its own mind, doesn't have free will, or does have free will? Obviously, if you've been listening to my lectures, if you've got any idea of any religion, Judaism, we know that that the answer we're looking at is going to be trying to demonstrate that God is real, obviously. Secondly, that God is conscious and he chooses, he's got free will, he actually chooses to do things. And then we want to determine which version of this conscious, intelligent creator is the correct one. So then we'll be looking at different religions. So once you know there's a God, then you've got different religions. You've got the sort of the more monotheistic, got to be careful with that, but the ones who claim to be monotheistic, we should say, that's be Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and probably Baha'i, and maybe Sikh possibly, and according to some Hindus, Hindu as well, so it gets a bit tricky with the monotheist thing. Or is there a polytheistic reality? Are there many forces? Right, so obviously, as in Judaism, there's only one creator, one God, and he has a specific message for mankind, right? As opposed to the other religions, which claim he has a different message for mankind. Okay, so how do we get to truth? See, the problem is to get to an objective truth, we know that people tend to clutch to what they're familiar with. We're going through different types of biases later on in the lecture. They give people comfort, right? Religion, even religious people, right? You can understand atheists definitely want to believe what they believe because it liberates them. They're able to do whatever they want without having the nagging feeling that they are objectively wrong or they're evil. No one wants to feel that they're bad, so even evil people want to justify their actions. However, even religious people, we've got to be honest, even religious people, they use religion in this utilitarian way. Yeah, I've even seen some atheists say that, yeah, religion's very useful, right? Because it gives you morals, it has many benefits, it makes it for a good functioning society. Yeah, even if it's not true, but we don't care whether it's true, as long as this artificial, arbitrary system happens to order society in a nice way where people are happy. That's the base value which these people have, happiness. Yeah, which is reasonable. So they say, yeah, why not be religious, right? Obviously, some religions are better than others in that respect. Some people believe in what they believe. Again, atheism or religious, through the spectrum of different religions. Doesn't matter who we're talking about here. This is widespread. This probably covers every group which you can think of, including Judaism. That's why we're going to have to do some tools in order to find out which one's the objective truth. Yeah, because people, including Judaism, as I said, believe what they believe because of the society they're brought up in. Yeah, you're brought up in a certain town. If a person's brought up in I guess, what's it called? That place called? They do voodoo, one of the African places. Yeah, they believe in voodoos and stuff. They believe that voodoo's true. Person's brought up in the Vatican, obviously believes Catholicism's true. Person's brought up in Saudi Arabia, he believes Islam's true, right? The person's brought up in a liberal city in the West. He'll believe that science is true and religion is archaic and outdated and wrong, right? Right, and if someone's brought up in sort of Mea Shorim in Israel, yeah, he'll believe that Judaism's true. So, how do we know which one's true? You can't base truth on on a seemingly random situation where you happen to be born into a certain sect or religion or mind thinks society. So none of these things speak to truth, right? The fact that you're born in a certain way, in a certain place, the fact that you prefer a certain way of looking at the world because it feels comfortable, it feels pleasurable, or it feels convenient, or it speaks to some sort of emotional, moral sort of instinct a person may have. But none of these speak to what's absolutely true. So the question is, you can ask the question, why is truth important? Well, that's a very good question. If a person can live a lie and be happy, or live truth and be sad, maybe living a lie is better. The problem is that if the truth is telling you that what you think is happy and pleasurable or good is actually wrong, then you're taking a very short-sighted view of your whole life and your whole existence, and you're going to be suffering in the long term, and you're going to regret it. That's what it comes down to, regret. Yeah, so people who say, well, religion, yeah, whether it's true or not, but I want to enjoy myself now. But 1 minute, think about it rationally. If religion's telling you that this world is tiny in relation to the whole expanse of time itself, right? We talk about a small dimension called the physical realm, the physical dimension, which is we're only here for 80, 100, 120 years. And even the pleasures in them are so fleeting, they're temporary. Yeah, no one can truly enjoy this world in a way where, they feel fulfilled, essentially. So what do we do exactly? And even on top of that, once a person's lived his life, right? Then what? Then it's just gone. So you sacrifice truth and the potential of an infinite, or whatever each religion claims happens after death. You're risking all that for something which probably isn't worth it, right? So therefore, absolute truth and knowledge of truth and basing your life on truth is a very important thing, right? Okay, so how do we determine what truth is? I think most people would say that truth is more important than just I'd rather live a lie and and the truth be damned, whatever. Okay, I'd like to point out one thing before we start, is that in Judaism we have a very strong stress on objective reality and truth. I can't speak for all religions, but as far as my investigations have been done, they've been relatively thorough. Most religions ask for a level of blind faith, right? They claim to have some sort of empirical or objective evidence, but when you push them, they sort of deviate and they go to subjective truth or blind faith, right? Whereas Judaism, we're commanded not to believe, we're commanded to know. This is in many times in Torah. One specifically would be one of the clearest ones would be in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 41. I'll check it up. 1 minute. Here we go. Yeah, this is chapter 4, and we're actually going to be using quite a number of the ideas in this chapter when we actually go into specific proofs. This is a very important chapter for anyone, especially people who believe in the Torah, to read, because this is quite compelling. A lot of the ideas which are brought down here. I think it's around. Are they close? Oh, 39. Okay. Verse 39, chapter 4 in Deuteronomy. You should know today and should return it. That means you should imprint it and force it into your heart. What? Ki Hashem hu Elokim. God is the one who's the master of all the forces in the universe. In the heavens above and the earth below, there's nothing else besides him. No other power besides him. Or on one level, there is nothing except him, essentially. Like we spoke about at the second Keystone lecture, about what the nature of God is. Yeah, but look at what we're commanded to do. It doesn't say believe. It says, you should know today. And you should internalize it. Return it to your heart. Okay? That's just the Jewish way of approaching things. That's why we're very analytic. We're always questioning. You go to a yeshiva, that's a place where they study the Torah, you'll see that they're always questioning, arguing, right? We're never taking anything, even fundamentals we don't take as given. I had an interesting discussion today, which I'm not going to go into, right? Yeah, about one of the fundamentals which we already spoke about on this. I had a question on it, and I wasn't scared to ask this very controversial question because I wanted to know the truth. I want to make sure I've got everything clear and correct. Yeah. Yeah, anyway, so let's get on with the actual process of how to determine truth. Okay, so the only way to determine truth is if you have, remember, we've got our minds and we have to determine truth based on input. We absorb certain ideas, evidence. That's essentially what it comes down to, evidence. We have evidence. Evidence is a very broad term. There's many different types of evidence. You can have empirical evidence. You can have experiential evidence. That's a type of evidence. You can have historical evidence. You can have eyewitness testimony, right? There's many, many different types of evidence which a person can have. And each one's got their own benefits and they've got their own limitations as well, right? The classic one which people are familiar with would be empirical evidence. Empirical evidence is very good for knowing the reality of something which is repetitive. Yeah, if you can repeat an experiment, then you can formulate your opinion. We spoke about this in the video about miracles in nature. That if you constantly drop a ball at different heights and it always follows the rules of gravitational acceleration, F equals ma or whatever it might be, then you can confidently say that within the parameters of whatever situation you have, this will always happen. So I could then take something which I've never done before and I can extrapolate. I can take, instead of a small ball, I can take a massive car and drop it off a very tall building, and I say it's still going to take follow these rules and it'll hit the bottom at exactly 7.9 seconds, right? Until you have a problem. Then you try it with a piece of paper and you say, oh, piece of paper doesn't fall down uniformly because of air resistance. Then you have to do more experiments to find more things. But this has a limitation. This can't tell us about historical events. Yeah, science can't tell us about historical events. That's why, for example, I don't want to get into this topic now, but just think clearly. The theory of evolution, it's not scientific because it's not something which you can reproduce. It's called a scientific theory only because scientists like this theory of extrapolating what the historical source of species are, right? Because there's two fundamental opposing views: either God created everything, right, or things naturally evolved, because obviously they believe there's no God, so therefore there's only the laws of nature, so therefore one thing evolved into another, right? And you're going to see there's a lot of bias involved in both sides with this, and that's why we've got to be very careful with this and eliminate bias as much as we can, which is what we're going to speak about today. But you see the limitation of empirical evidence. Empirical evidence will not tell you where we come from, right? And it won't tell you about the reality of even these laws will not work if they're outside of the confined system. Yeah. So, for example, all these laws of motion we've spoken about, they're all true in a vacuum. However, once you've got air, then depending on the shape and the weight, the makeup of the object you're dropping, it will actually travel differently because you've got a new element in, and now you have to make it more complicated. You have to take in air resistance. Yeah, an aeroplane in the sky does not fall uniformly. On the contrary, it actually can get off the ground. How does that work? Because you've got a new element called air resistance. You've got the what's it called? The aerodynamic effect. Is that what it's called? Okay, so there are many types of evidence, and you have to know which evidence is appropriate to use in which situation. Okay, right. So, and we have to be able to weigh up whether you can use certain types of evidence at all relative to the question you're asking. So, for example, if someone comes with empirical evidence and tries claiming this empirical evidence proves evolution, you know they must be wrong, because it's like chalk and cheese. The empirical evidence doesn't talk to that. You're using something else. You're using your knowledge, which you found out using empirical evidence of science, and you've discovered in science there are certain things called mutations, and then you're saying, and therefore, maybe this is how we got here. Maybe it's a suggestion, right? And then it will have its own set of evidence. Fossil records, maybe that would be a good supporting evidence for the theory of evolution if the fossil records lined up with what you'd expect the model of evolution to be. Right? So if you say that things evolved very, very gradually, then the first thing to come to mind is the fossil evidence, as Darwin himself said, should indicate this. That means you should see millions of different very small changes in the fossil record. So you shouldn't have distinct species necessarily. You should have a graduation between each species, like between, let's say, a monkey and a human. You should have thousands or maybe millions of different minor changes where eventually you see the monkey is a bit more like this, or from a fish to a bird. You'll see the fin get slightly shorter, and you see a few species like that, and then it's slightly shorter, and then you see maybe the start of some feathers, or whatever it happens. But the fossil record's not like that at all. In the fossil record, you've got distinct species, more or less, with maybe a couple of halfway in between species, but nothing like the gradual effect, which some evolutionists say. That's why some evolutionists come onto something called punctuated evolution, that essentially a monkey gave birth to a human. Essentially, by a fluke of nature, the genetic code changed suddenly, and you've got a big jump. Okay, it's punctuated. It's not linear, it's punctuated, which has got its own problems. It fits in with the fossil evidence, but it doesn't make any sense logically. How did that happen? You don't get that happening. And if it happened once, that was a complete fluke. And for this to happen thousands of times for each species, it's just beyond the pale, basically. Okay, I've just disproved evolution for people who straight thinkers there, but okay. Both theories, but yeah. But again, but the point I'm trying to bring out here is the type of evidence for something like evolution would be looking at the fossil record and matching it to the model of what you expect the theory to end up with. Whereas if you want to work out what happens when you drop something, then you use empirical evidence, because that's something you can repeat, and that's a much stronger form of evidence. You can be more sure of that, right? Because the evidence is really imminent. It's right there in front of you, and you can just demonstrate it as many times as you want. Okay, historical evidence, something else, right? How do we know that there was a Roman occupation of Britain? You only know that because of history books. How do you know the history books are true? Well, there might be archaeological records, things which back up the stories, but primarily it's going to be history which was written down by historians, right? And their empirical evidence is completely irrelevant, and fossil records are completely irrelevant. So you see, different types of evidence are needed for different things which you want to prove. Okay. Right. Okay, just turn the fan on here, so hopefully it doesn't affect the recording too much. Okay. So we spoke about, to know the truth, we need evidence. Evidence, there's many types of evidence, and we have to know which type of evidence is going to be relevant for the thing which you want. So what is proof? Proof, you're going to say, is taking the evidence and linking the evidence to the thing which you're trying to prove, and saying this logically shows the truth. A shows the truth of B. A being the evidence, B being the theory. Okay, now, to be very clear here, there is no such thing as 100% proof. That we have to get out of the way to start off with. And this is a very, very big problem when trying to have the discussions about what truth is. Because some people who haven't thought about life or how thought process works, how evidence, how proof works, they make this assumption, to prove something, you have to prove it's 100% true. That means there can't be any possibility otherwise. Now, without direct revelation, that means internal, intrinsic knowledge, that means knowledge of self or prophecy, right? Even there, personal revelation can also be deceptive. People can hallucinate. Yeah. Without that, without having some sort of intrinsic knowledge, it's impossible to have 100% proof. In fact, because as you can easily demonstrate, you could show that there's very, very unlikely, I'm not even sure if you could put a percentage to this. How do you know anything is real around you? Maybe you're the only real thing in the universe, and everything you experience is some sort of hallucination. Yeah, people can dream, they can have experiences. So we know there is such a thing as having real, vivid experiences, but yet we know they're not true. As you say, dreams are true. Not going down that rabbit hole, right? So if we're being honest, we can't really reasonably demand 100% proof for a theory. Okay, that's the first thing. Now, especially, you could, in theory, if you want to be a purist, you could try to aim for something as close to 100% as you can. But here we've got a different issue. Here we're speaking about questions which are not just theoretical in nature. We're talking about questions which affect our lives very deeply. And we have to make a decision. We can't just say, well, if there's God, 75% there, is a God, 25% atheism, okay. All right, nice question. Okay, let's move to the next question. No, you can't do that. These questions are essential for living and making decisions. What do we do in life? What's our direction in life? We have to get an answer. It's not good enough just to have a theoretical answer, right, which is more likely one than the other, and then we say, okay, we don't have 100% proof, so we'll leave that on the side and we'll address other questions. No, you can't. You need an answer for this question. You can't ignore the question and say, well, you don't have 100%, we don't have 90% proof. So what we have to do now is look at different standards of proof. The evidence will point towards a certain theory, and the more the evidence, and you've got new pieces of evidence which corroborate the existing evidence, the more likely it is that this is the truth, and maybe this opposing view is less likely to be the objective truth. In maths, for example, you can say it's based on axioms, right? Axioms, by the way, can always be disproved or questioned, right? Like, for example, parallel lines always meet. So based on that, so therefore the laws of geometry will work, whatever. Yeah, you've got different angles. If an angle is, if you've got two parallel lines, and you draw two parallel lines across there, then you know that these two angles are the same as each other. It's an F angle, I think it's called, yeah? But that's all assuming that parallel lines, yeah, they never meet, and they truly are what we call parallel. But you can actually show that parallel lines don't always follow this rule. In fact, if you look at a globe, you immediately see that parallel lines, they do meet at the North Pole and the South Pole. They meet each other. The lines of longitude, right? They start from the poles, but they're parallel. They're parallel lines. Because parallel lines never meet only on a flat surface. But on a curved surface, the surface itself causes the parallel lines to meet. So again, so even axioms can be questioned. So again, we don't really know anything 100%. Even mathematical proof, there's some level of doubt in it. Yeah, we look at Newton. Newton's laws of motion looked absolutely 100% proven until you get into the quantum realm, where in the late 19th, early 20th century, where you have this new reality of the micro or the quantum level. We're looking at how photons and electrons and atoms work. They follow very different rules. And based on that, and you've got theory of relativity and things like that, based on that, we have to reinterpret all of Newton's rules, and we see that Newton wasn't right. He was right if you're in a system where things are not moving relative to each other, whatever, right? But technically, he was inaccurate, right? You have to bring a new dimension. You have to, just like when you discover that planes can be curved as opposed to just flat. Yeah, if you take into account that the rules of the quantum world, that means the microscopic world, whatever, then you understand that reality is not as it seems. So even axioms can be taken apart eventually. So how can we prove something? That's the question. So therefore, different things, as we said, have different standards of proof. Right? So for example, let's give a simple example. In a court case is a classic example where people want evidence to prove whether someone's guilty or not guilty. So let's look at what the case is. If you're trying to kill someone, right? Let's say there's a death penalty, and this person, you've got 95% chance he's the murderer. 5% chance, that's really, it's very small, but significant. 5% that he's not the murderer, or you're going to kill him. So now you weigh up the potential outcomes of each side. One of them, you just killed a person. The other one is he's still alive, but you could put him in jail or whatever. And if you don't kill someone who murdered, how bad is that? Okay, so surely, so many people say, well, that's how we take on the Western society anyway. I think it's reasonable to say this, that to kill someone who's innocent is much, much worse than to acquit someone who's guilty. So therefore, our burden of proof is going to be much more weighted in favor of having to prove that he's guilty. That's why we have the assumption that people are innocent until proven guilty. That's not objectively true, but for practical purposes, that is a reasonable way to act and to run our justice systems, because of this value of human life which we have. And killing someone who's innocent is such a bad thing that in order to do that, our evidence has to be beyond reasonable doubt. What that is, if we want to put a number to it, maybe 98%, maybe 90%, maybe 99.999%, who knows? Yeah, can you put numbers on this? However, if you've got a case, is this person guilty of stealing, right? Then, or let's say something even more simple, you've got argument who this object belongs to. And you've got evidence, this person's got evidence that it belongs to him, this person's got evidence belongs to him. There's no reason why we require one person to prove his point 98%, because the two outcomes are actually balanced. Either this person owns it or that person owns it, right? And there doesn't seem to be anything else in that case anyway to require us to have anything more than a 50.1% chance that he's right rather than him. Okay, so in that case, where the outcomes of equal weighting, that you don't have a lopsided look, you're going to kill a person, or you let him go, okay, not so bad, right, compared to killing an innocent person. So therefore you'd say, okay, whichever one the evidence points more to, that's what we'll go with. And you have to make a decision. You have to make a decision. You can't just say, well, it's only 59% or 78% in his favor, but it's not 100%, it's not 99%. So therefore, so what are you going to do? You've got to decide who to give the object to. Do you just say, no, leave it in the court, and the court will hang on to it until they get more evidence? That's not fair to both of them, because the real owner is definitely going to lose out now. So what do? So therefore, reasonable thing to do with, we can only weigh up the best of the evidence we've got at the moment, and it's pointing to what they call them, there's a word, two people arguing in court, defendant and prosecutor, claimant, I don't know, person number one. Yeah, again, my English lets me down again. Yeah, all for the best. Right, person number one, we think the evidence is 55% on his side. Person number two, 45% on his side. We'll go with the 55 and we'll give it to him. Or maybe if it's £100, we'll give £55 to him, £45 to him. Maybe that's a fair way of doing it. But let's say you can't do that. It's an object which you can't split up. It's got its own intrinsic value. So you've got to give it to the person who's got the more evidence. Right? So when we're questioning religion, so we already spoke about this at the beginning, what standards of proof do you need? So what are the two possibilities? Whichever way you go in the question of religion, especially between two different religions, there's a big problem, right? Because one of them will usually say, if you get it wrong, you're in massive trouble forever. And the other one will say the same. So therefore, these are balanced. So therefore, we'd like to get as much evidence as we can to make ourselves very confident that this way is true and that way is not true, and therefore we follow the true way. However, if you can't, so this is how I want to try reframing the way we think about things now. So therefore, if you can't determine convincingly one way more than the other, the rational approach would be take the side which is 50.00001%. That's the only thing to do without taking anything else into account. That's what you have to do. A rational person would do that. There's no other way of clarifying it. You have to go with the slightly better odds, where things are pointing slightly more towards. Yeah, if we can even give numbers to these things. Okay, you can see it's not so straightforward giving arbitrary numbers. It's not a quantitative question ultimately. We're going to see there's a qualitative aspect to the evidence as well. And that comes on to the second point, which we want to bring out now. How do we know how to evaluate evidence? What tells us that this is 51%? This is a convincing piece of evidence. Now, we can understand if a person, let's go to the murder case, if we have two witnesses who are unrelated to either the person got killed or their family or to the murderer, and they say, yeah, we were walking down, we saw this person stick out a knife and he stabbed the guy, he killed him. Yeah? And we could clearly identify him. Yeah? Okay, can you? That's pretty strong. That's a 99% evidence. But maybe it was dark. No, but we took a picture. And this is the picture we took because we didn't want to forget. Oh, it's a picture as well. Wow. Okay, this is a slam dunk case. Right? Maybe they didn't have a picture and we think that he was tall. He was 6'7" and he had blonde hair. We didn't quite see his face. It kind of looks like him. How many 6'7" people are there? Okay, that's convincing. I would say that's 95% already, just based on the description as well. But they didn't see his face clearly. Okay, there you go. A question. Okay. Right. So you look at different qualities of evidence here. People seeing the person's face, that's convincing. If the judges themselves saw the murder happening and they got the right to the discretion to judge a case based on themselves, they can definitely judge, because them seeing it themselves is going to be much more convincing to the judges than two witnesses testifying in front of them. Let's say you've got circumstantial evidence, or you've got things like motive. Motive is a very weak form of evidence. It can corroborate strong evidence, is it? And you know, we've even got something to help us. We've already got our 95% evidence, but he had a motive as well, because this person, we heard for days earlier, he gave death threats to this person. He said, I'm going to kill you, and it looked very convincing he actually meant to do it, right? So maybe that motive evidence can push you to corroborate the already existing physical evidence, like you saw the person doing it, or you saw a very tall person in combination with this. Yeah, things are pointing very strongly that this is the person who did it. However, if you only have motive and you don't have any evidence besides motive, you can't do that. People exaggerate. They say, I'm going to kill this person, right? And I hate him. And we know why he wants to kill him. This person maybe destroyed his business and now this person's lost everything. He doesn't have livelihood anymore. Okay, that's significant. You wouldn't kill him based on that. That evidence is not qualitatively. And you can have 100 pieces of evidence like that. But if you've got one piece of evidence which tells you, we saw the face of the person who killed him, right? And then you've got 100 examples of the fact that a different person had motive to kill him, and he had opportunity, let's say, right? And we see that he's got a knife in his house, okay? A big knife which can kill someone, okay? But there's no evidence that there's any blood on this knife. So there's certain things which can tell us, indicate, yeah, there's a possibility he killed him. 100 pieces, but 100 pieces of weak evidence do not equate to one piece of strong evidence. What makes something a strong piece of evidence and something a weak piece of evidence? How do we know that maybe motive is a strong piece of evidence? Stronger than actually seeing the person's face. How do you do that? Obviously, we know that seeing the face of the killer while he's doing the killing is much stronger than 1,000 pieces of evidence that he had motive. Yeah. Or I'll give another example just to show how quality of evidence. So basically we're saying the quality of the evidence is everything. It's not the number of pieces of evidence. It's the quality. There's intrinsic quality. But how do you measure quality? I'll give you another nice example. I can bring you so many examples through mathematics, science, whatever, yeah, that we don't exist. Right? One simple one is if you take a simple timeline. Imagine you've got a timeline, yeah, which goes from, let's say, the year 1900 to the year 2100, yeah, and we look at the present, yeah. Where are we now? So we look at the present is a point in time on the timeline, a point, right? And we look at the year 2000, which is bang in between the year 1900 and the year 2100. So, how much of the time is after 2000 as a fraction? It's exactly half is from this point from the year 2000 to 2100. How much is from the year 1900 to 2000? Half, right? So according to this, how much time does the present take up? It doesn't take up any time, because the totality of time is half before the present and half after the present in this example. So therefore the present mathematically doesn't exist. Yeah, which is actually true mathematically. The concept of a point is it doesn't have any dimensions. You can only measure things between 2 points. A point itself doesn't have its own length by definition. So since we assume we are living in a point in time, so therefore we don't exist. Right? That is a very convincing mathematical proof. It's a brilliant proof, in my opinion, of course. Right? I think so. Objectivity is a very good proof. But yet, do we exist? Yes, we do. Why? Because our experience is so much more powerful as a qualitative form of evidence. Our own lived experience, everything tells us that we exist. Yeah? And you have this theoretical thing. I don't know how to answer this, but I just know there must be a flaw in your working. Is that bias? Or is it that we've got a very strong form of evidence as our lived life experience? Everything, every bone in our body tells us that no, we exist. It must be there's some sort of trick or some sort of flaw in the logic there. Okay? Right, so we see that the quality of the evidence is much more important than the quantity or the number of pieces. Okay? Right, so how do we assign quality to something, to a piece or pieces of evidence? How do you do it? Now this is the key to the lecture here. So there is something called, in Judaism, we call it da'as. It's a type of knowledge which we all have. A person can have abstract knowledge, he can have detailed knowledge, there's something called da'as. It's a type of knowledge which is connected with who you are. It's connected with your own self-awareness, your sense of self. For example, if a person can know something is true, but he doesn't internalize the truth for whatever reason. We're going to see why a person doesn't internalize it. A person can study like 10 years about the effects of smoking on the body, and you see all the evidence and everything. So, wow, yeah, interesting, yeah, wow, yeah, and you can even give lectures about it. So therefore, smoking is dangerous for your health, right? Yeah, and he can do it while he's smoking. What's going on there? Is because he's left the knowledge as a theoretical knowledge, but he hasn't internalized that this knowledge actually requires a change in behavior if he knows what's good for him. That's what da'as is. Da'as is a type of knowledge where we collate the knowledge together into one place and drive it into our minds, and it becomes not just a theoretical idea, it becomes a reality, and your existence is tied up with the reality of that knowledge. So, in the case of the smoker, he's left it as a theoretical thing, right? Because he hasn't internalized that knowledge. We're going to see why he hasn't internalized that knowledge. And why don't people internalize knowledge when they have it? It could be the reason people don't internalize knowledge because they're not confident in the knowledge. Yeah? If a person says, there's a few studies done by some unknown people that say that it's dangerous to be outdoors more than 2 hours a day. Why? Because there's stuff in the air, whatever, heat, radiation from the sun. All right, okay, maybe are you going to really listen to that? You might not listen to it because, okay, come on, it's a hearsay. You don't know who these people are. Yeah, you look at the evidence. Yeah, okay, it's a bit convincing, but, come on. It doesn't seem to line up with our view of reality so easily. So people will reject it. Yeah, and also it's just inconvenient. You're willing to risk. There again, you've got that balanced risk. The person knows that if he stays at home for his whole life, he'll never catch a certain disease, a certain virus. Right? We're not mentioning any names here. Right? I think we'll think of a recent one which was very widespread. Or you can function normally, but you've got a small risk to catch this virus. Right? So you 100% will be safe by staying indoors, let's assume. Or if you go outside, you've got a small chance. But the sacrifice of not being a functioning member of society and not experiencing this world for the rest of my life is such a negative that I'm going to ignore the evidence. The evidence is true, yeah, but I don't think it's worth it. It's not worth it. So again, right? So therefore, da'as means you've got to weigh up the evidence and you're going to see, is it true? And is it worth following that truth as well? Once we identify these two factors, whether it's objectively true and therefore this truth should, on balance, influence our decision making, right? So therefore, then our knowledge will actually cause us to change. This self-awareness, this sense of self. Yeah? If a person doesn't know what it is, just close your eyes in a silent room and just think. It's called meditation, right? Just think about your thought process, what's doing the thinking. Be aware of yourself. And that's how, unfortunately, some people are not even aware of their own thoughts. They're so distracted by the outside world. They don't have any self-awareness. They're just sort of being pulled outside of themselves by all the attractions of the outside world and the outside stimuli. They don't realize there's something which can think, and that's who they are. So it's a bit scary. So in case my viewers generally don't have that problem, but just in case you do, meditate, think about who you are, and you'll realize that there's a part of your mind where knowledge means something, and you've got to act on knowledge. Okay, you've got to live your knowledge and treat it as a reality. Okay, so that's what Das is. Das is the ability to give value to things. You'll be able to, it's like, imagine you've got scales in your head, right? So Rav Noach Weinberg, so the head of the Torah yeshiva, yeah, it's one which they did outreach. They tried making Jews more religious, right? And he asked them a question: give me 10 reasons why you should just pack up today, go back to America or wherever you come from, and just ignore everything we've learned. So people, yeah, this reason, this reason, this reason. Now give me a reason. Give me 10 reasons why you should stay. Right? People weren't interested. They weren't convinced by any of the arguments they had. So no, we can't think of it. Okay. Right. So let me ask you. He said, give me 10 reasons, and for each one I'll give you $100. Each reason you give me. So people started rattling off this. What's going on there? Their bias was telling them they didn't let these reasons be part of the das, be part of their awareness, that their thought process which brings to actions. Once they had an external incentive, the biases disappeared, and then they were able to give some very good reasons why to stay. Well, because knowing truth is important. This is our eternity we're talking about. Oh, very good. Okay. So why didn't you have those reasons to start off with? It's because your das wasn't engaged, right? Your biases were pushing you to not internalize these things. So now, I'm not sure if this is what Rabbi Weinberg did. Now look at these reasons and meditate on them. Is this a good reason to stay a few more weeks? Yeah, you're 20 years old. A few more weeks trying to learn about your heritage, to learn about God, to learn about what's the truth of existence. Is it worth it? Because you might live another 80 years. Is it worth sacrificing a few weeks now to address these important questions, or just go back and just live your life mindlessly as you did before without addressing these questions? Think about them. And a person's mind will tell them, yeah, okay, if you're serious, these are important questions. Now let's address them. So now let's take all the lectures we've had so far, and wow, okay, so that question about, the interesting proof of God's existence or the proof of the Torah, that was, until now, I thought, yeah, that was interesting. But now you're thinking, 1 minute, awareness, this is important. Let's treat it properly. Wow, if this is true, I've got to change. This is really significant. That's what das does to a person. Das, this self-awareness, this knowledge of self, this knowledge which it's associated with the back of the brain, by the way. You've got the right brain, the left brain, to do with global thinking and to do with detailed thinking. That's the left brain, right? And then you've got the das, is the back, where we put the knot of our tefillin. We put the phylacteries on every day. The straps and the box represent different parts of the mind. The transcendent part is at the front. You've got the right and left represented by the right and left straps, to do with the right brain and the left brain, the creative part of the brain and the detailed part of the brain. And then at the back there's a knot of the tefillin, where that is put on the part of the brain which is called the da'as, right? That's the part where the mind connects with the spinal cord which goes into the body. Right? So the part of our mind which connects thoughts to action is the da'as, and that's represented by this bone at the back of our head, which is the place where the brain links up with the spinal cord, where the mind links with the body, where thoughts connect to action. That's what da'as is. Okay, how do we activate our da'as? How do we make sure we've got our da'as? Our da'as is the thing which can take evidence. Yeah, remember, I've got 100 reasons why I should just stop listening to Adam Herskin's lecture now. I've got to go for my football match or whatever. I've got to go for lunch. And yeah, I won't listen to the rest of the lecture. But there's one very important reason why you should keep listening. You want to know the truth. Is knowing the truth outweigh 100 different reasons to not listen anymore? I would say, obviously I'm biased, okay, excuse the pun, because that's what this is all about. Of course, if this potentially could change my life in a positive way and make sure that I'm correct about truth, and he's got this way of thinking which makes a lot of sense, I've got to internalize that. This piece of evidence or this piece of knowledge is so important, it outweighs all the other pieces of knowledge to tell me to ignore it. It's the idea of giving value to pieces of information. And we can use that by actually evaluating different pieces of evidence, as we'll see. Yeah, you can have loads of pieces of evidence that, let's say, atheism is true. Yeah, for example, why do bad things happen? Right? We don't see God. Why is he not revealing himself? Why there's so many arguments between religions? If there's one truth, then obviously, right? Got lots of different reasons, but with one lecture which I gave, the very first lecture, that essentially answers all the questions, right? God hides himself for a reason, and there's evil for a reason. So that basically, that one piece of information, that one piece of evidence, I would call that a philosophical evidence, a logical piece of evidence, because there's a logical reason why a good God would produce bad things. That completely destroys 100 pieces of evidence to the alternative. And a person's mind, if it's balanced, should come up with that conclusion. This piece of evidence is more significant than all the other ones. Why? In this case, because this actually answers all the other questions. Right? Why is there evil? There must be evil. If God is good, therefore he wants us to get the maximum pleasure. The maximum pleasure is to be like God. And being like God means we are giving infinite pleasure to something which is infinitely lacking pleasure. So therefore, there has to be a realm, a dimension of things which are lacking reality, lacking pleasure, which we call pain and suffering, and bad and evil, lacking good, which is evil. There must be a realm, a body which is on the personal level, something which is completely lacking godliness and goodness and pleasure, in order that the soul has something to give to, right? As we explained at length in that first lecture. So, that's what we end up with. Our da'as, our self-awareness, when we think about different pieces of evidence and we try to take away any sort of bias, we end up having maybe even just one piece of evidence, but it's so convincing, it's such a strong piece of evidence that it can outweigh many other pieces of evidence. Or you can have many pieces of good evidence against many pieces of bad evidence, right? So the pieces of good evidence would win as well. I'm not saying there's only one. On the contrary, my whole lecture series is going to show that there's many different categories of proven evidence for God and the Torah, right? But each one in itself, I believe, is good enough to outweigh any counter evidence, because I don't believe there is strong counter evidence to God. Not significant. Please leave in the comments if you got one, and we'll work through them. I think there's very weak evidence for any other religion to be true once you accept there's a God. We're going to see that, why Judaism is much more convincing than other religions. Okay, again, we'll leave that for the actual parts of the series which speaks about the truth of Judaism as opposed to other religious beliefs or philosophies. Okay, so what stops us? So this is where we're going to finish off now. What stops us using our das, our awareness, to weigh up things objectively? To take this piece of information and give value. This piece of information, this piece of evidence has got much more value than these other pieces. What stops us? The answer is bias. And this is absolutely critical because bias destroys everything. This is what kills people. This is what makes people make wrong decisions about their life. I'm not talking about the big questions. Even your regular running of your life. You can have a miserable life because of biases, right? And even more so, a person can go and choose his eternity to be a terrible decision, which he's going to regret for a very long time, if not forever. Okay, I'm not getting into those details now. Based on bias. Bias is essentially an emotional input which twists and corrupts our pure scales of giving absolute value to the pieces of information. Our mind, without bias, is very, very powerful for determining truth. It's an extremely powerful tool. In fact, I think it's the only tool we have for determining truth. Our da'as, our knowledge and self-awareness, how to integrate pieces of knowledge and then take the whole spectrum of knowledge and pick out the pieces of evidence which are meaningful and ignore the ones which are not meaningful. Like the smoker, right? There's scientific studies, empirical evidence who've shown there's control groups. It's a very, very strong form of evidence, scientific evidence. They've got 1 million people who were tested. Yeah, half of them were smokers, half of them not smokers. And there's control for any other factors you can eliminate from the equation, with age, country of birth, lifestyle, income. That's all been taken into account. The only thing which is different between these two groups is one smokes, one doesn't smoke. And you see that there's beyond the margin of error, because you're about 1 million, that's a massive number. So the margin of error of it's going to be very small. The variation, I can't remember what it's called. It's a small percentage which you can, which your margin of error is. Let's say you've got a study which can have a 5% variance, right? And it shows that there's a 51% chance that something's bad, but it could be that based on the evidence, it's actually 46% or 56%. So that's very, very weak, right? But if you've got something which is 60% this is true and 40% it's not true, right? And the variance is 0.01%, you're pretty sure that the 60% is accurate. And therefore you can safely go after the 60% or whatever. In this case, it's what effect does smoking have? And we see that on average it takes 10 years of a person's life, and that's an accurate figure. Then you don't want to risk being one of those people who gets lucky. Well, I had a grandfather, a great uncle, who smoked 2 packets a day and he lived till 110. Yeah, but the anecdotal evidence compared to scientific evidence, it's not worth risking everything that you happen to be one of those 1 in a million people whose smoking actually doesn't affect them. Maybe it's beneficial for them, right? Against the massive weight of scientific evidence which tells you it's dangerous. You're not going to do it because your dust tells you what the truth, where the truth lies, and the risk of going with the weaker evidence is just too great. I'm not risking my life for that. But people do have biases, and biases do make people do this self-destructive behavior in all aspects of life. And that's why human beings are a very strange creature compared to any of the other living creatures in the animal kingdom, plants, whatever you want. The sea life, birds, whatever it is. Only humans have this self-destructive tendency. Why is that? Because we got something called das, right? Awareness to actually think philosophically and to change our behavior, sometimes in a self-destructive one, because once a person bases decision not on natural laws of functioning, of survivability, on survival, like most animals do, if you could call mankind an animal, and for this purposes we are, they have a mind, and the mind can make them do things which is counterintuitive, because we think, we take evidence in, and we can look beyond our natural instincts, and we can change it. That could be for good or for bad, right? But that's all based on the fight between objective abstract thinking and internalizing abstract ideas, which is what the das is meant to do, and the role of bias, which is the emotions which fight against that objective reality of the mind. And bias can destroy everything. So, just to show you how pervasive and how powerful biases are, we're going to give a few examples of bias here, and we're going to show how you're going to know in yourself you've definitely got almost all, if not all, of these biases, and they really affect your life in a negative way. And everyone can recognize this. I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say everyone's got these biases, and they all recognize. You can recognize how every single piece of this bias has a significant effect negatively in your life. Okay, so let's start off. Something called confirmation bias. That means the bias when people they favor the information that confirms their pre-existing beliefs or views of reality, and when there's evidence which would objectively counterbalance and contradict their status quo, they reject it, or they water it down, they make it cheap, they make fun of it, saying, this religious evidence, scientists never mention this, so it must be a load of rubbish. Well, think about the evidence of this person who actually had a revelation. I'm saying I don't believe that's a strong piece of evidence necessarily in itself, but at least take into account, think about it, think if it was true, that'd be convincing. But how do you know it's true? Maybe he's just making it up. This person's got a history of psychotic hallucinations. Okay, so that's your answer. That's a good rejection of his piece of evidence that God exists because God spoke to him. Okay. Or you know that he's making a lot of money out of people believing him. Okay, that's a reason to doubt a person. But take into account at least. Don't reject them out of hand based on the fact that you're more comfortable continuing to live your way of life with your belief systems without having to alter them because something is challenging your pre-existing beliefs. That's the primary form of bias. People like to feel that they've been right until now, and anything which contradicts you want to not listen, and things which confirm your pre-existing way of looking at the world, you're going to give more value to. So now you're corrupting your da'as. You're giving more value to one piece of information than another based on your bias to confirm your pre-existing beliefs. Okay, so for example, a person might believe in atheism, right? Right? There's a famous, I think, a very good example of this is Richard Dawkins. Right? There are other atheists who listen to both sides of the thing, and they come up with their conclusions for whatever reason, right? That they end up being atheists. But this person, particularly, just the one which jumps to mind, he seems to have an irrational hatred for religion, right? And people who believe who makes jokes about it, listen to what they're saying. Listen, take into account what they're saying, and the way he dismisses certain pieces of arguments or pieces of evidence in a laughing way shows that he's not taking them seriously. You take every piece of evidence seriously, at least for a moment, until you can give a good reason with your da'as, with your awareness, why this is a false approach. Give a reason, give an argument. Consider the validity before rejecting them, right? But simply because it contradicts your current beliefs, you get rid of it, and therefore a person is trapped. He's trapped in an echo chamber. He's only going to listen to things which echo his own beliefs. And anything which doesn't confirm your pre-existing beliefs, it's going to bounce off. As it says in one of the prophets, I think it says, their ears have got heavy, or the hearts are hardened, right? They're not letting the truth of God's warnings and God's rebuke come into their hearts. They're just going in their own way, and they go, I'm going to be fine. But you're not, because God spoke to you or your ancestors, and he told you this is very important to keep the mitzvahs, to keep the commandments, and you're not doing it, and you're going to end up in trouble. The temple's going to be destroyed if you don't change your ways, right? Your prophets, we'll be okay. Why? Because I don't want to listen. My bias is pushing away from my da'as. I'm not going to let my da'as, my awareness, give reality and significance to these pieces of information which are affecting my comfortable way of my belief systems, which I have at the moment. Another type of bias is called anchoring bias. Anchoring bias is when, I'm not going to list a few forms of bias here. These ones are much more significant in terms of trying to determine truth. But you can see in the way that people live their lives on a much more smaller, trivial level, they have other forms of bias which mess people up. Okay, but these ones are very, very serious, so I'm going to speak them out. So confirmation bias, that's the bias where people want to give more weight to evidence which confirms their pre-existing beliefs, so therefore they're not going to change now. Anchoring bias is when people want to assess evidence in front of you, and whatever happens to be the first impression, this is what first impressions count, whatever the first piece of evidence is, they're going to subconsciously drift towards that one. In fact, there's a law in the Torah. A judge, he's forbidden to listen to one of the two plaintiffs, I remember the name, plaintiffs, right, before the other one. So let's say one of the plaintiffs comes in and he says, okay, this is the case, that person, I lent him money, he didn't pay me back, and this is my evidence, before the other one comes in. And then when the other one comes in, already it's made an impression on the heart of the judge, and when he hears the second person, there's a natural tendency to believe the first one more. That's called anchoring bias. Because the way that it's just a practical way that the mind works. It wants to have security, it wants to have, what's the word? Wants to be sure of itself as soon as it gets a piece of evidence. So it says, okay, that's our starting point. Our starting point is this person's right. Now this person has to prove that the first person's wrong. Because you have to have a very mature mind to say, okay, I've got a piece of evidence here. We'll put that in a holding pattern. Let's hear the counter evidence. Okay, now let's weigh them both up. Naturally, a person with a weaker mind will take the first piece of evidence and make that his sort of foundation for weighing the pieces of evidence up. But already you've given more preference to one piece of evidence purely on the fact that it was the first piece of evidence you heard. Okay? So if a person's listening to a debate and he's undecided about whether Judaism and Christianity is true, or Islam's true, or whether there is a God, there's not a God, it's very dangerous. I don't like these debates which they have, where one person gets to speak for 15 minutes first, and then the other person sets out his stall for 15 minutes. That's not a good way of doing a debate, because people will naturally, assuming you don't have the confirmation bias, so you just like skip, oh, this guy, I just want to hear the guy on my side hear what he says. So you're going to skip 15 minutes to hear him. But assuming a person's trying to be objective and he doesn't have a preconceived, stance, I don't know whether there's a God or not. I don't know. I'm open to both sides. And in truth, he is. So his das has gone past the confirmation bias problem, but he's going to end up with a new problem now. The one he hears first is going to have a natural, smaller, but significant influence on his thought processes. You have to be aware of that. Okay? We can't get rid of biases completely. Yeah, we're going to show some methods to help tackle biases, but be aware of them. First of all, you have to be aware that you've got biases. Once you've got biases, then you've got a chance, you've got a hope of eliminating them and weighing things up objectively. But if you're not even aware of your biases, then I can bring you 100 proofs, which I have more than 100 proofs. I'm not sure we get through all of them, but we get through a lot of them. Yeah, there's definitely dozens of categories of proof for God and for the Torah. I would claim objective proof, evidence. One which the Das would say, yeah, you're correct, Adam. But if you don't recognize your own biases, I can throw 100,000 pieces of proof. You're just going to throw them away and say, no, but scientists don't say that. But 1 minute, I've shown you evidence to contradict the scientists. I've shown you how the scientists' proof are limited in. But you're going to ignore everything because of your biases. This is what this lecture is trying to get through to you, whoever you happen to be. Okay? Could be a religious person, could be a Jewish person already, could be someone who's thinking about Judaism, could be someone who's very strong atheist, and you want to see what this Adam Heuristic, you claim to be an objective person, so it's only right I listen to Rabbi Heuristic and his arguments, and I'll try to weigh them up objectively. But okay, fine. I'm very happy if any atheists come on this channel and listen to my series here. But be aware, you've got biases, I've got biases, and I hope I know my own biases. I hope I do. We're going to work out methods to analyze your own mind to see where your biases lie. But anyway, being aware of the predominant main forms of bias is very good starting point. So confirmation bias, anchoring bias, the first piece of information, right? If you're the first time you experience, let's say, grow up in Tuvalu or something like that, or Fiji, and they don't know anything, they're just like happy, they just live their life, they're not aware of any philosophies, God, no, we just live our life, we're happy, right? And then you get exposed to the idea of religion or philosophy. The first one which comes to your country is going to be the one which is going to have the strongest effect. And we see that in certain countries where they had missionaries, like in certain African countries, the Christian countries, because you had missionaries going there, right? And they had them, okay, fine, well, but then we have another set of missionaries coming from a different religion, and say, oh, they're heretics, because they're already ingrained in this first philosophy they had. Okay. So if they have the compelling evidence to counter that, they're less likely to listen to it, unless they're aware of the concept of anchoring bias, that the idea, the first opinion you hear makes a lasting impression. First impressions last, as the saying goes. So confirmation bias, right? Anchoring bias. Now there's another one called the availability heuristic. This is a very practical type of bias, and I would say many atheists have this one, right? I speak to many people and I can detect this problem. Yeah, their bias is based on the fact that in their world they have lots of weak forms of evidence, but they've never heard of the evidence for Judaism, and therefore their bias is it's different from confirmation biases. Subtle. It's the availability of the evidence you have in front of you naturally gets you to overestimate the importance or the likelihood of events based on how easily the examples come to mind. So if you're a scientist, you're aware of this experiment, that theory, that's in your realm of recognition, right? And then you hear about the Jewish claim, historical claim. Well, I've never heard of that before, but okay, that's sort of like in your mind's eye, that's over there, that piece of evidence. But you've got all the ones in your face at the moment, and you try to be objective, but your natural, immediate set of knowledge can distort your perception of these questions, right? Why? Because you see, it's to do with how common and how pervasive something is. For example, if someone hears about scientific explanations of the universe, but you never heard of an attempt of an objective argument for a creator, the existence of a God, you might overestimate the validity of your scientific bubble chamber or echo chamber, right? Not because that's what I've believed until now, which is confirmation bias, but because I just see so many examples of scientific evidence for what I believe is an atheistic approach, and I don't see that many, so therefore naturally the piece of evidence which I'm familiar with, I'll give more value to. They're subtly different from confirmation bias and anchoring bias, even though they do tend towards the same thing. It's like first impressions, essentially. Yeah, confirmation bias, that's an ultimate anchoring bias. Yeah, it's because my whole life I've lived like this. So yeah, so that I tend towards a piece of information which back up my preconceived view of existence. Anchoring bias. That's even if I haven't lived like this until now, but you give me one piece of information, I'll go after the first piece of information more than the second one, which is essentially a form of confirmation bias. Or confirmation bias is a form of anchoring bias, because that's the first piece of information is the first 20 years of your life. Or availability heuristic bias, right? That means your pieces of information which you're trying to be objective, but they're all pointing towards one way because you haven't yet seen the other forms. That's also a type of anchoring bias, right? That you're giving more preference to the pieces of information which you have readily available. Then you have something called the Dunning-Kruger Effect. This is a nasty one. The Dunning-Kruger Effect is basically, it's a very interesting one. This is not very intuitive, this one. But you'll see it in people you know, probably. That this happens when people who have limited knowledge of a certain subject or competence, ability to do something, they overestimate their own understanding. So this is sort of a bit of a narcissistic type of bias. And they'll estimate their level of knowledge more than people who actually have more expertise and underestimate and undervalue their point of view or their ability of the other people. It doesn't mean that you're not right. Again, bias, you could end up happening to be confirmation bias. Me, for example, I think I'm right, but I've got a strong confirmation bias to think that Judaism and God is true. And I still think I'm right, despite the fact that I'm aware of this bias, because I try, you're going to see, to use methods to eliminate bias when you're trying to weigh up things. And I still came out with the conclusion which I did. Okay? But you have to be aware of these biases. Right? Yeah. So this is a very, very damaging, this is a horrible one in my opinion. I've got a natural aversion to this one because it's a horrible one, because you get people who reject truth not because of an unfortunate situation, but because I think this is more malicious, even though you can't blame people for this so much either. Right? A person with superficial understanding can be very confident in their conclusions, and they ignore the depth and the nuance required for much more informed perspective. Yeah, you can understand how this can completely mess up any discussion about truth here. Said no, I know about quantum theory, yeah, and quantum theory means there's no real truth because everything is in superposition, and you end up with these crazy ideas. But okay, you're really not understanding the idea of quantum theory, and when the correct place to apply these ideas, and it's just give me a headache. When you deal with people with Dunning-Kruger effect, it's really frustrating because you're talking with someone who thinks he knows more than you, but you know that he knows less than you. And you've got to be careful that maybe I'm the one with the less knowledge. He's got more, but I know that that's not true because I know I've studied this for years, these ideas, and I know that this person's never thought of these ideas before, and he's just making them up on the spot now as if he's an expert. It can get very, very frustrating. So you have to be aware of the Dunning-Kruger effect, whether you're the ignorant one or the intellectual one, is that you've got to treat the other person with respect as well. He could be coming up with ideas at the top of his head, but you still have to address those. You can't just reject a person who's the first time he's thinking about proofs of God, and he comes up with this theory where there can't be a God. Why? Because of this. I still have to take that thing seriously and have a good reason to rebut it. But he definitely should be aware of his lack of knowledge and the fact that he's just making these ideas up now, right? And he thinks because he's got experience in certain other areas, so he thinks he's good in this area as well. It's irrelevant who's got the more knowledge. What's relevant is what's objectively true, and that can only be based on evidence itself and weighing it up in an unbiased way. But someone, you have to be very careful of overestimating your own, the importance you assign to your own knowledge, because it could be you just don't have that knowledge yet. And don't disparage someone based on your assumed superiority of intelligence. You can't do that. You just have to get that out. Have the humility and think that maybe someone does know better than me, even though I feel pretty sure about this because I've got very strong pieces of evidence, and that person, I know better than him. Be careful. Then you've got the framing effect. This is a nasty one, especially in debates. You can present information in a way which is true information, but you can say it in a certain way where the framing itself causes a bias. Okay? So for example, if you've got a discussion about religion or whatever, the way that the questions are framed can seriously affect how you interpret them. For example, I can present the existence of a God as an emotional rather than a rational question, can affect how a person comes out of the discussion or how he takes your evidence. So for example, if I want to present my form of evidence, and I know, let's say I'm going from an anti-Jewish perspective, I happen to know that Jewish people are very into this objective way of thinking about things and being critical. So what am I going to do if I want to prove the truth of a religion which doesn't have this level of objective critical thinking? I'm going to try bringing an emotional element into proof, and I'm going to show that experiential evidence or emotional evidence is more important than historical evidence or logical evidence. And when I frame my piece of evidence, God spoke to me, or I was suffering from a terrible life, and then God came to me, or this whatever came to me, or this experience I had showed me the truth. People might be listening to that, and people who like emotional types of evidence will listen to the emotional approach much more than the cold, boring Adam Erskine way of approaching me, which is very cold, very trying to not get biased way of presenting the evidence. Okay? So again, how you frame something. Like for example, if you say 90% of people believe in something, is different from saying 10% of people believe that this is just not true. Even though technically it's the same thing, the way you frame something has a very strong effect on influencing people, and lawyers know how to do this very well. They've got all the evidence in front of them, but they're going to show you why believe in this piece of evidence more than this one, because this person's character is so strong. How could he possibly have done this terrible thing? But the other person's saying, okay, he's right. This is a very upstanding member of society. This is a priest. How can this priest do these terrible things with these children? As we know, that there's stories which came out a few years ago. So you think character evidence, so we couldn't possibly, this person's a famous film star. This person's a celebrity. He's a family favorite. How can you believe that he's done these terrible things? That's speaking to emotions, right? You're framing whether a person has done something based on an emotional piece of evidence. He must be a good person because he makes so many people happy in his weekly show where he brings children and he grants their wish and everything. Well, how could he do such horrible things? Right? That's you're framing the evidence in a way, that your emotions should be more important than the fact is that some people have actually tried to complain and they get shut down. They've been censored. What does that tell you? Maybe they're making it up. It could be true that they're making it up. I guess you go into the realm of conspiracy theories now. Who says conspiracy theories are wrong? Yeah, I'm not saying my opinion either way. Could be some conspiracy theories are more convincing than others. But what makes something a conspiracy? Oh, it's a conspiracy theory. So you're speaking to an emotional bias that something which arbitrarily is called a conspiracy theory is probably a crackpot idea and probably wrong. Wait, look at the evidence. Forget about what you're calling it. Look at the evidence. Does the evidence point to it? Objective evidence? Okay, so let's have a look. There was a certain, I'm going to get in trouble with this with some of the viewers, but let's try using this. I think it's a good example. When I was weighing up evidence whether I should take a certain vaccine for a certain illness, okay, let's not get ourselves in trouble too much. I was looking for evidence on both sides. All I could find was people, it was very asymmetric. There was the mainstream media and the big voices of governments saying this is good for you, right? Everyone should take it. And I heard people saying, well, let's question it. Let's find, give us more information. So no, don't ask. Anyone who asks for information, who wants to have a debate, they're a denier. 1 minute, that's rang alarm bells in my mind. 1 minute, why are you trying to close down debate on this? That sounds like you've got something to hide. Whereas the other people say, we're happy to have a debate. And we genuinely don't know which way is correct. but at least debate it. If you frame things in a certain way, you say, like, well, most scientists say that the climate is changing 97%. Okay, so wow, that's convincing. But so what's the evidence? No, you're not clever enough to know the evidence, right? Okay, well, that could be true, but at least attempt. I need to make a decision. I can't just trust people blindly, right? 97% does sound convincing. But 1 minute, you're saying 3% don't say that. They're also scientists, so there is two sides. Again, how you frame something can really warp how people who are not trained in thinking, who are not aware of biases, and how you can be gaslit, as they say, or influenced. Right? If you're not aware of these, you're in trouble. People frame things in a certain way, that's propaganda. You can have the same piece of information, but describe it in a different way, you get a very different conclusion. Just be aware of it. So cut out the noise, cut out the way people present the evidence, and try focusing on the actual evidence, and use your own mind to make the decision to weigh up the evidence. Okay. Then we've got 3 more types of bias we're going to speak about now, just showing you how pervasive bias is. And you can see these type of biases in the small decisions and big decisions in your life. Status quo bias, again, similar to the types of bias we've had so far, confirmation bias. But it's status quo bias is a preference. I don't know. It's too overwhelming, everything. I'd rather keep things as they are. It's like an inertia type of bias. I'd rather not change. Right? It's a bit different from confirmation bias, where the bias positively makes you want to accept certain types of evidence over other ones, the ones which confirm your echo chamber. Here it's different. Here it's... I hear both sides of the argument, but since I don't have a definitive... Since I can't make a conclusion, I'm going to stick with the status quo. Which is reasonable, but the problem is sometimes that bias to stick with status quo can take a piece of the weight of evidence. Let's say it's 55%. The weight of evidence tells you to change, and 45 tells you don't change. You're actually correct in your preconceived assumptions, which you had before the discussion, right? So they basically, as according to our theory, you should go after the 55%. But the problem is the bias makes it look like the 45% is more like 51%. The bias twists your ability to evaluate the evidence, and now something which is slightly more on the incorrect side of the equation, that means the 45% you would ordinarily in an objective pure situation reject. It makes you feel that the 45% is got more value than it really does, and it's actually 55%. Because remember, there are no numbers to this. It's how the mind tries to weigh things up objectively. That's a problem. That's a problem with status quo bias. So your long-held beliefs, when you produce counter-evidence, right? That unsettling feeling will influence you to stay with your pre-existing belief systems, right? Even if you do give value to the other piece of evidence, but that will skew your view of which evidence is more important and more significant. Then you have the bandwagon effect bias. It's another type of bias. And this is wanting to jump on the bandwagon. And this can be from the fact that this is the current thing. You see this a lot with especially the political left, I would say. They tend to change their beliefs based on what's popular. So, for example, I believe in, like, there's a meme, I believe in blank, the current thing, and that you got a person with, like, you take the microchip out and you put the new current thing in, and that's what he believes with conviction. This is what I've always believed in my life. Yeah, Russia's evil, Ukraine are good. And then Black Lives Matter, or getting the order chronologically wrong there. Yeah, Black Lives Matter, the vaccine, that's the right thing to do. People who believe COVID is made in a lab, they're evil. These are evil people. Or now you've got, free Palestine. Yeah, that's what we believe with conviction. Why? That's because everyone else is doing it. Or I believe we should accept people's redefining of reality in terms of genders, right? And you see an incredible study, I think I saw, that a fifth of people in a certain age group, a young age group, now believe they're transgender. That is incredible. I'm not sure how many studies were like that. That makes no sense. Would they really... You're telling me that this is a natural phenomenon, that all people until now, a fifth of them were actually transgender. They were just too scared to say it. And now, because it's much more open, that people are coming out in their true gender identity? Or is it the bandwagon effect? People want to be part of this new movement, so they're twisting themselves to be part of that. I would say this happened about 60 years ago as well, when it came to normalization of people who were attracted to the same gender. Let's put it like that, in a nice way. Yeah, they say, well, 5% of people are like that. They're just too scared to admit it, right? And now, because we're more liberal, people are more ready to embrace that. Or is it the fact that this is getting drummed into our psyches, that it's totally okay to be like that? Then people start to consider it. If without the propaganda, without the strong force to recognize this form of living as okay, without having that, people would naturally be attracted to the opposite gender, naturally. It's only because there's a push, and now there's sort of a bandwagon effect. Now people are starting to say, well, no, this is okay, and in fact, maybe I'm like that. Yeah. This is kind of confirming my will to be part of the bandwagon, to be part of the big movements, to be part of something bigger, because people are naturally scared to stand out in a crowd. People are scared there's a bias to go against the current thing, to go against it. That could be a bit of a proof of Judaism, because we've always been against the vast majority, the mainstream. Monotheism itself, as we said, Abraham is called Abraham the Hebrew, the Ivri. Ivri means you're on the other side. That's what the word Hebrew means. It means you're on the other side, right? It's got nothing to do with the actual nature of Judaism. Yeah, Judaism, the word Jew means to thank. We had a whole lecture about that, about gratitude. That's what a Jew essentially is, someone who appreciates. Our whole being is who we are, is to appreciate that God's giving us everything, and therefore we try to give back to God as much as we can, so to speak, and being givers as well, doing what He wants us to do, which is to be givers, right? That's who we are, right? Whereas the Hebrew it comes from the Hebrew word Ivri, Ivrit is the Hebrew language. Ivri comes from the idea of Aver, from the other side, because we always tend to be cultural, which in itself shows there's something significant about Judaism in itself. Just the fact that we are not going with the trend. We're not just following what's popular or what the pervasive philosophy of the day is. That tells you something about the nature of Judaism, is that there is some sort of conviction. It could be that we're just ODD, opposition defiance disorder. It's just someone saying something, we try to do the opposite. So yeah, okay, there might be something in that as well. So you can't use it as a proof in itself because there's that possibility as well. But it's an indication that we don't just take things because of a natural bandwagon effect bias. There is something else which is pushing Jews to do the opposite of what most people do. And on the contrary, now people are coming over towards the ethics of the Jews. That's the Judeo-Christian values. So we're having an influence in a positive way. And that's the idea of being a light to the nation. Hopefully people take on the morals and ethics of what we believe God's given to us, and hopefully make the world a better place in that way. Okay? So of course the bandwagon effect that can be from what the current thing is, or it can be what a country's beliefs are. A person's brought up in a Christian country, as we said before, he'll generally become Christian because he'll want to jump on the bandwagon. And when there's a new movement which is going against the culture, he'll tend to reject it because there's a comfort being with the majority. And then the sunk cost fallacy is the last one we'll speak about. Sunk cost, that means a person's invested in a certain business or investment, let's say in a financial sense. A person invests in a business and he's put a lot of money into developing a certain idea, and we can see that there's maybe a different way of doing it, and we have to basically bin much or all of the R&D, the research and development which we've had until now. But that means that we've wasted a lot of money. But at least, okay, we can cut our losses now and we'll invest in the new thing. But there's a tendency to maybe we can still make it work. Why? Objectively, this new method, this new way of developing, what was it? It was something like that. Was it Spectrum and was IBM? Something like that. There's some sort of. I think that's what happened with Microsoft actually, to work the other way. So apparently Linux is an operating system which is meant to be much more robust and good. It's better than Microsoft, but people tend to want to stick with Microsoft because, well, or maybe Microsoft themselves. I can't remember how it worked. Maybe it worked with IBM and other forms of developing computers. I can't remember. I apologize. I think there's a very good example, an anecdote to illustrate this, but I can't remember it. It was something along these lines. That someone invested, maybe it was Apple, maybe. People were trying to develop a certain way of I think it was Spectrum and IBM. Yeah, and that's why, or Apple, that's why Apple became irrelevant. With the iPhones, they became popular again. But I think Apple computers were absolutely terrible. They just, no one was interested because they didn't make it IBM compatible. Because they invested so much into developing the Apple form, but they saw that, but practically everyone's going to just go with Windows or IBM. So maybe we should just try to let go. We'll try to be our own people, our own development, our own efforts into developing the Apple name, but be at least IBM compatible. At least we won't cut out a massive part of the market. So no. They were adamant. No. We've invested in this. We've got a brilliant way. Unfortunately, we think this Microsoft is going to be more popular, even though we think it's inferior. But so do we go with that? No, we'll go with our way. We're going to stick to the Apple guns, and we're going to develop our computers. And we know Apple computers were completely not popular compared to the IBM versions. And yeah, they got lucky, I guess, later on with the iPhone seemed to be much more popular. But in terms of the operating systems, the Windows one ended up being the standard. But why did they do that? It's because they didn't want to admit that the investment they had and all the effort they'd done was in vain. So let's just stick with something, even though it might not be the best thing, because we've already started. So let's just keep going. There's a natural tendency not to change because you've already pushed yourself onto a certain path. which sounds a lot like confirmation bias, but it's a different form of confirmation bias. Because you've invested so much. It's not just because this is what you also already believe in, but you've invested so much into it. So, for example, it can happen for a person where you see sunk cost fallacy might come out where you wouldn't see confirmation bias. Let's say a person decided to change. I'm going to change to this religion, right? I've worked very hard, and this is the religion, and he spends the next 20 years in this new religion. And he's put a lot of effort into it. And then he realizes, actually, the original religion which I was in is actually probably correct, right? So from my point of view, someone who's Jewish, right, for 20 years of his life is Jewish, and then he decides, I think this is the correct religion. And he rejects Judaism, right? And he spends a lot of effort, and he builds up. I'm actually thinking of a specific person that actually a Jesus leader here. Actually, he was born Jewish, and then he, because of whatever certain things in his life, he had problems with drugs or something like that. And then I'm not sure exactly how the story goes, but then he found this religion, Christianity, but a Jewish flavor to it. Now, imagine after building up his whole empire, he's very famous, made a lot of money from it as well, I think. Yeah, but the natural bias he would have to change now, let's say in one of these debates, one of the rabbis for traditional Orthodox Judaism would actually show, you're just making a big mistake. It's obvious this verse contradicts your beliefs, this verse does, over and over, and you're claiming proofs from these verses, but if you look at them in context, they're not talking about that. So an objective person will say, oh, okay, maybe I was wrong, maybe Judaism was right all along. But he's going to reject that because he put so much effort, and he put so much of his life, half of his life has been invested in this new way of thinking. Yeah, so it's not confirmation, it's a type of confirmation bias, but confirmation bias could be that I was brought up Jewish originally, so I go back to that. So the fear of admitting that all of that emotional, maybe even financial investment in a certain way of thinking has messed me up. Is messing me up. To admit that and reject all that emotional and financial or whatever it happens to be, intellectual investment or honor, self-respect, to admit you're wrong is very embarrassing as well. It's very painful, and that would naturally make the evidence, which might be 90% that you're wrong, 10% that you're right, that 10% now looks in your da'as as much more significant. Well, that's 55%, and this 90% is actually more 45%. So no, I hear you where you're coming from. Yeah, no, but I still think my side, on balance of evidence, is stronger. But that balance of evidence has got skewed because of his very strong emotional cognitive dissonance, we call it. This is the effect of bias. The effect of bias is cognitive dissonance, is you cut out one side of the equation in favor of the other because the bias pushes you that way. All right. So we've shown many very significant forms of bias here. How do you get rid of bias then? And I know myself, I've got some of these forms of bias. I've definitely got, at least looking at the list here, sunk cost fallacy for sure. Bandwagon, maybe in some ways I've got that as well. Dunning-Kruger, I'm scared to say I don't have it. By definition, Dunning-Kruger, you've got to be careful that you are that ignorant person who thinks that you know more than you do. Confirmation bias, for sure, that's a big one for me. Anchoring bias, I was brought up as more or less religious, not the more orthodox form, maybe, but I was definitely brought up Orthodox Judaism. Maybe my form of it has changed over the years. But anchoring bias, Availability heuristic to an extent, yeah. Framing, not so sure about that type of bias affects me too much. Status quo bias, definitely where I am in my life now. Definitely status quo bias is a strong bias I have. Yeah. So yeah, almost all the types of bias, and I try to be very objective. I can see the biases are definitely there. So how do I'm asking the listener here, the viewer, to get rid of your biases when I'm admitting I've got my own biases. So if the theoretical, objective Jewish approach, which tries to cut out bias, I'm admitting my biases, how can I expect anyone else to get rid of their biases? So we have to have methods to eliminate bias. How do we do that? This is the only way we can know truth, is by using our da'as, our self-awareness, that part of that aspect of our knowledge which makes the piece of knowledge which we have give value to them and become reality where we have to act upon them. But how can we do that if we've got bias which skews the whole tool which we've got to determine truth? That tool being the da'as, the mind. That is the tool we have to weigh up. Those are the scales where we can weigh up pieces of evidence which are qualitatively different, but we assign value to some pieces of evidence than others. How can we use that tool if we know there's something which is corrupting the tool? So the only way we can do that is somehow by eliminating bias. This is very hard, but I think it's quite simple. I personally, it could be my bias influencing me to think that it's simple, but again, I think most people will agree with me here. Yeah, when it comes down to it, whatever perspective you have on life, there's certain things we agree on. We agree that hopefully anyone listening to this, atheist, Jewish, other religions, no specific beliefs, you'd all believe that bias is something which can corrupt a person's thought process. Like we all agree about the smoker, and if you're a smoker yourself, so think about something else. Someone takes drugs is bad for them. I don't take drugs. Yeah. Okay, that agrees that there's something called bias which can skew a person's ability to think about things. And we all agree that certain objective truths should be taken into account. Otherwise, we risk destroying our life either now or at least in the near future or after we pass from this world and we find out what the reality of existence is. That is a big deal, and we should definitely base our decisions at least taking that into account. At least maybe not that might end up not being the defining thing which causes us, because we could end up believing, based on evidence, that there is no afterlife, and therefore the main thing we should use our life for is enjoying it the most, or being a good person the most, whatever the new thing which we should base our actions and the way we live our life on will not be on the afterlife if we believe that, based on the evidence, there isn't an afterlife. But at least we have to act differently and live our life based on the evidence in some way. So we have to make sure that the bias is not making us make the wrong decision. We have to. So we have to get rid of bias. That's what it all comes down. This whole lecture is we have to get rid of bias in order to allow us to weigh up evidence fairly and objectively. Otherwise, we are doomed to make the wrong decision, which we will regret at one point in our lives eventually. And we don't want to do that. So, I've got 4 ways of eliminating bias. They're not foolproof, but they're approaches. And the first way is, before we start, is just be aware of our biases. Yeah. Once we're aware of our biases, we've already got, I would say, more than halfway to eliminating bias by the fact that we're aware of our biases. Okay? We might not be able to get rid of them, but at least being aware of them is most of the way there. That's why I spent such a long time going through different pieces of bias in order to, so we're aware of them. So once you're aware of them, hopefully it's easier to identify when we feel we actually are being biased. So, but let's think of more concrete ways of actually attacking bias and destroying it as much as we can. One way is we try to look at any question about belief or the big questions, try in your mind to visualize it as a maths problem, as an objective problem which doesn't have any consequences to which way the evidence is going to point. So look at it objectively. Okay, evidence for God. Okay, that's this one. Evidence for atheism. Very interesting. No relevance to me in my personal life. Try doing that the best way you can. Try weighing up the evidence. Try being nonchalant about the evidence. So, okay, so let's think. Okay, so this piece of evidence seems to point that way. That points that way. 1 minute, that's not such a convincing piece of evidence. And be matter of fact about it. If you can treat the questions of existence which have a massive effect on how you're going to change as a person, as if they will not affect you, then that takes out a massive amount of the bias already. Because confirmation bias, anchoring bias, why do we have those forms of bias? It's because we've got an emotional desire not to change, or to go after the first piece of information, or to fit in with the crowd. So if we become not emotional about it, why are we emotional about it? Because we know it's going to, back of the mind, we're going to have to change if we admit that this is a truth as opposed to what we've believed until now. So if we can trick ourselves into thinking as we're trying to assess the evidence that this isn't going to make any difference to my life, yeah, very nice, won't make a difference, yeah. Whatever happens, I'm gonna don't think about what the effects are going to be. The best we can, hopefully, if we treat it the same way we treat a maths problem, yeah, or a piece of trivia which has no bearing on our life, hopefully that will cut out a lot of the bias, or at least the effects the bias would have on us. Okay. The second way is to use our dance itself, use our self-awareness. Remember, bias is going to make our way of evaluating a piece of evidence skewed. Why will it be skewed? Because we are letting our emotions dictate what we feel more comfortable with, as opposed to the hard changes we might have to make by changing. So if we use bias itself to get rid of bias, that'll be a very clever way of doing things, right? So if we focus on the idea that the truth is the only thing which is important, you have to start off with that. And the next bit is critical, even if it's painful or inconvenient. And we're going to have to be embarrassed. We're going to have to not go with the bandwagon. We're going to have to change our status quo, right? Those are very strong emotional pushers to push us to not change or not take any evidence seriously. But then we take the idea that the truth is the only thing which is important, and this outweighs everything else. The importance of knowing truth, and that however comfortable things are going to be, it's going to be much worse if I'm going to have to, let's say, burn in hell for eternity. Or I'm going to end up missing the opportunity of a lifetime of having a connection with God. And the risk of that is so much worse than embarrassing myself in front of the whole world and having the pain and effort of having to change everything I believe in, uprooting myself and feeling that my whole life has been a waste until now. and everything I know is not true, but that's nothing compared in comparison to the pain I will feel once I realize I've been wrong the whole time. If you really internalize that emotional bias, the bias to have got your whole life wrong in the first place because you convinced yourself that I'd rather be living in a fake life, a fake reality, and that bias caused me to have an everlasting regret. So that emotion itself, make that an emotional thing. Make the fear of being objectively wrong and the consequences of that worse than any of the other biases we've spoken about. So I'm so scared. I think personally this is one thing which pushes me the most. However comfortable I will feel by rejecting counter information, the fear that I'm getting it wrong and that my belief in what I cannot believe, that being wrong is going to be such a painful thing if I get it wrong and I reject new evidence, and that new evidence, which if it was true would cause me to regret this for eternity, that fear will make me, that will sober me up so much that I'm going to try being as objective as I can and try to, I don't care how this, what the results of this analysis will lead me to, because I know the truth is the only thing which is important, and that's going to be the most serious thing. Emotionally, the truth will be the most important thing for me. So that will help me much more to treat the weighing up of the evidence as a maths problem. The fact that I'm emotionally invested in the truth, I have conviction that the truth is everything. Physical pleasure, being conforming, is nothing compared to being wrong. If I'm wrong, that is everything. So hopefully that frame of mind will help you when you take into account weighing up the evidence on either side of the argument. That will help eliminate any bias which might skew you to have the natural forms of bias, because we're creating a new type of bias of wanting truth. And that bias is a good type of bias, because that bias is the bias of not having bias. I hope you get that, and you can actually, if you internalize that in every ounce of your being, that truth is more important than any of the conveniences which the other types of bias which we've mentioned today give you, then that will just eliminate them, because that bias will outweigh the other biases. And this bias you're happy to have, objectively, this is a good bias. The bias to want truth more than anything. Okay. I don't think there's too much of a negative aspect to this bias. So you're contriving a type, basically what you're doing is you're taking your emotional, the dangers of going after your emotions and creating a new emotion which counteracts those emotions and cancels them out. I don't care if it's going to be painful. I don't care if I'm going to have to go through torture for the rest of my life if I know ultimately I'm going to regret not having gone through this path. The regret of getting something wrong should outweigh everything. And that should be the scariest thing for a person. And therefore you're going to be as objective as possible, even if it means living your religion, even if it is admitting your whole life's been a lie, even if it means you're going to have to now put a lot of effort into changing yourself and you're not going to be comfortable in your life anymore. Those emotional fears are nothing compared with the fear of not being objectively correct. So if you can do that, if you can, then already this is a good way of being much more confident that you're going to be right in any of the decisions you make in working out what's the truth of reality. Is there a God? Is there not a God? Is Judaism true, or is something else true? Because hopefully now your biases will be towards knowing what the objective truth is, irrespective of what you happen to be already or where you prefer to be emotionally. Okay, those are two sort of quick ways of getting rid of bias. Okay, either try ignoring any external influences by treating the questions of life and reality as a simple logical math problem, right? Similar to a math problem, I should say. Yeah, where it doesn't make a difference whether 4 times 4 is 16 or 17. As long as the answer's right, yeah, I've got the right answer. Good, it's 16. Great. But if 17 means that you're going to have a lovely life, but 16 means you're going to have to do something which is inconvenient, don't make 4 times 4 17. Never do that. Yeah, just it doesn't mean that 4 times 4 equals 17 will not make your life easier, because it's just a maths problem. 4 times 4 being 16 or 17 doesn't make a difference to your life, so don't make an issue out of it. Or you could say that I realize that 4 times 4 equals 17 will make my life more comfortable, but if 4 times 4, if the absolute truth is 4 times 4 is 16, and that would make my long-term life, my eternity, in a way where I wouldn't regret things, that means even though every ounce of my being tells me that I want the truth to be this way, because it's going to be more convenient for me now, but there's something stronger which is telling me that I have to take the evidence of the truth to be more important than my will and desire for things to be comfortable, then hopefully that bias towards truth. So you hit this way, instead of cutting out emotions, you're using a counter emotion to beat the first emotion. The emotion to be comfortable and to indulge your biases are going to be outweighed by this new bias to know the truth, because I know that getting the truth wrong is such a bad, scary idea, because the consequences are absolutely dire and disastrous. Okay, 2 approaches. Either cut out emotions the best you can, not easy, some people could do it, or create a new bias which is going to outweigh any other bias, and therefore this new bias of knowing the objective truth will be the main needle of the compass which points you in the right direction. And any other biases, they're a joke, because you've looked at the big picture. Okay, the other 2 ways of getting rid of bias, I believe, are to live a life of truth generally. If you are a person who's willing to admit you're wrong in even the trivial things in life, and even to admit that you're right occasionally if you think you are right in the trivial things, this is going to help you have a life of truth in general. So when you look at the big questions, hopefully you'll be balanced, and you'll look at the pieces of evidence in a fair way, in a balanced way, in an objective way as much as possible. If you live your whole life as being an objective person, you're more likely to be at a natural advantage when looking at the bigger questions, that you'll naturally be more of an objective person, as opposed to a person who's your whole life you haven't been interested in truth. You've just been interested in enjoying yourself, and now you think, well, I should really think about the truths of life. You're the one who's in more of a danger of being vulnerable to biases, twisting your scales of weighing up evidence. So for someone like that, try already now to be objective in everything you do in life. Truth is everything. Tell the truth. Be a true person. Be an honest, reliable person, a loyal person. Yeah? Try to stay away from making a shady business deal where technically it's okay, but if you can stay away from that, no, but this isn't right. It's not the straight way. If you can, then you're keeping that needle pure, that needle of balance of what's right and wrong, what's true and false, wrong. You're keeping it clean. So therefore, you'll find it much easier to deal with biases, because the way you function naturally will be in an honest way. So therefore, you've created kind of a new bias. My bias is to be objective, because I've got confirmation bias that the important thing for me in my life is being a balanced and objective person. So when evidence comes along, I'm going to naturally have my confirmation bias. So see what I did there? Using this new confirmation bias in a positive way. My confirmation bias is to be balanced and objective. So let's have a look. You got me more information? So this is Rabbi Kellerman's approach. Rabbi Lawrence Kellerman, he's like, I think he compared himself to, I can't remember, it wasn't Huxley, was it? An empiricist. Basically someone who says, yeah, I go wherever the evidence shows me, right? So he spoke quite hit me quite powerfully after many years of being a rabbi, right? And he thinks he's got the best proofs of that the divinity of the Torah. Then he spoke to someone who actually, he entertained the idea, said, well, actually, if my whole basis of being Jewish is this, and this person has an equivalently strong piece of evidence for his religion, I started picturing myself. How would I look in a turban, like meditating in this cult or this religion, whatever the story was, until he was able to detect the flaw in the other person's argument. So, actually, superficially, it sounds like you had the same level, weight of evidence as the Jewish evidence for the truth of Judaism. You had the same sort of weight of evidence for your religion, but I see the way you've described it, it's actually night and day. Okay, fine. I'm okay being a rabbi still. Fine. Okay. And then he felt okay there. But he actually really entertained the idea that, yeah, okay, my whole life I wasn't a religious Jew. Then I realized the evidence was pointing to Judaism. I'm Jewish now, going full force with it. But with the light hand, if the evidence comes one day to show that actually Judaism is not right, there's another religion which is more convincing, then I'll go with the other religion. Fine. Because his whole way of thinking, he drummed into himself from as he was growing up and as he was maturing, truth is the most important thing. Yeah? Whatever that happens to be. So if you live your life as a person who likes truth, you'll end up having an advantage that you don't have to work so hard to get rid of biases, because your natural bias, your confirmation bias, is to be who I am. And I'm a person who loves truth, not a certain religion, not atheism, not Judaism, not this religion, not agnosticism, right? Right? That's a position as well. I hold myself to be a balanced person and I take all the evidence in. No, I genuinely am interested in the truth, and I will change. An agnostic, generally, they're happy to stay on the fence. That's a bias in itself. But a true empiricist, someone says, I'm happy to change based on the evidence. I'll go where the evidence points me. Hopefully, if they're true to that mindset, then any piece of evidence will influence them the right way, and they'll be able to weigh up the evidence fairly. Because that is their primary emotional pull in life, is to know the truth. The fourth way is to train yourself to be an objective thinker, right? So it's a bit similar to the last one. So like in yeshiva, in the Talmudical colleges, the Jewish colleges of learning, we're trained to do this the whole time. Yeah, this is what we try doing. We question. Someone says something. Who says? Prove it to me. Okay. I'm not 100% convinced, but it's better than my approach. I'll go with your approach, but with a lighter hand for the time being. And then you find something. Oh, in 1 minute. No. Now I'm not happy with you anymore because I found this piece of information which contradicts. How are you going to answer that? Like that? No, but that's not quite right. okay, that answer's good. The 1 minute, but then I kind of find the figure, 1 minute, but this backs up my position. And then we have this backwards and forwards the whole time. We're constantly debating. We've got a drive to know what the truth is, right? And because of that, we naturally think in an objective way. We become cold thinkers. We try to be objective. And that's the beautiful story I had. We'll finish off with this. Of those two rabbis, very famous rabbis, I can't remember who they were. They're having this argument. They're going backwards and forwards. Saying, no, this can't be right because of this. And they say, no, you can't be right because of this. And after much pondering, one of them says, actually, yeah, on the balance of evidence, I think your approach is correct. And the other person's thinking, yeah, I'm weighing up the evidence now. Yeah. I think on the balance of evidence, I think you're right. I think I am right. Because they're thinking so objectively. They're taking their own personal biases to be the one who wins the argument out of the equation so much. So that's a very strong bias, to be the one who's right. Yeah? No one wants to be proven wrong in a debate. That's why debates are very bad ways of determining truth, because no one's going to admit they're wrong in the middle of a debate and embarrass themselves in front of everyone else. Unless they're really pure people. I'd like to think that I would be like that, but who knows? Hasn't happened yet. Not in the big questions anyway. I have admitted that I've been incorrect in big settings for minor things, yeah. But for the big things, I haven't had to do that, because hopefully my way of looking at things objectively has hopefully led me to the right conclusions, so therefore I will never have to do that. But right, so but the idea is to be a cold objective thinker. Okay, so the 4 ways: look at the subject. If a person has not, 2 ways of eliminating bias are ones which you can do quickly, and 2 of them are a different way of thinking about your whole life. The first two ways are either look at the question of weighing up evidence as a maths problem, as if it has no relevance to your life, and hopefully bias won't come into it, because your bias, whether this have an effect on am I going to have to change my whole life? That's irrelevant. Yeah, just look at a trivial maths problem. Yeah, this is interesting. Don't let your bias come into it. Don't let the meaning of the consequences of this question scare you at all. Make it just like as if it doesn't affect your life. And once you work out the conclusions, then engage your bias. Now we've got to do something about it, because this was objective and now it makes a difference. The second way is do the other way around. Yeah, is use the fear of being objectively wrong, more scary emotions, more scary than the fear of being proven wrong in the first place, or having to change your mind, or go out of your echo chamber, or going against the in thing, the current thing, or the way that the world seems to be pushing in a certain direction. Yeah? Be more scared that you'll in the long term be, in God's eyes, or in your eternity, being wrong then. That's much more scary than being wrong temporarily here in this physical world. The third and fourth ways are more of an approach how you live your life generally. If you're a person who loves truth generally, yeah, your emotions are more in tune with being correct. Not because you want to be correct, but you want to be attached to what absolute truth is. That is a goal, an ideal in your life. Absolute truth, objective truth. It's a wonderful thing. And even in the small things and the big things in your life, you're geared towards truth. You're much more likely to be able to weigh up evidence cleanly and objectively. And the fourth way is just to train yourself in your practical way of thinking, is to be critical and a cold thinker, generally. Whenever you approach anything in life, you think. You don't just listen to people because this person said it, he's a big scientist, I'll listen to him. No, think critically. Think about what he's saying, not who's saying it. This rabbi says something, really. I've got a friend who's very like this. I get scared because I think this is just heresy. Like this great rabbi, you're going to say, no, who says? I don't believe him. But he's right. But maybe don't say it in such a derogatory way. Maybe still respect the great rabbis. But still question them. Question where they're coming from. And I find most of the time, if you... with most rabbis who we do respect, they end up being correct. We actually end up being the ones who overlook something because they have thought things through. But either way, the fourth way is to train yourself to be an objective, cold thinker. And if your whole life you train yourself to be like that, if you go to a yeshiva, we do that the whole time. That's the way we learn the Talmud, is by constantly questioning and forcing ourselves to not let our emotions influence, because we're more interested in getting the correct answer. So we don't want to be biased. So therefore, the fourth way is train your life to be an objective, cold thinker. Whereas the third way is a bit different. Train yourself to love truth. That is your bias. Yeah. So you see, that's the first and second way, a bit like the third and fourth way. So the first way, look at everything as if it's got no relevance. Yeah, that is the fourth way. Just the fourth way is look at everything in your whole life like that, and train yourself to naturally think like that. So, right. And the second way, which we spoke about, is create a new bias. The bias to be scared of getting things wrong. Yeah, is more of an issue than being scared of having to change your life and the inconvenience of changing based on the truth. That's really what the third way is telling you, but do your whole life like that. Don't just do it for this problem. Yeah? Okay, you give me evidence of whether Judaism is right or another religion. Okay, I'm scared, but I like this other religion because that's what I was brought up with, but I'm too scared that that if I'm wrong, that's going to make even worse consequences. That's going to outweigh my desire to be right in accordance with what I've been until now. That's to do with a specific problem. But the third way is actually the second way, but you apply it to your whole life. You make your whole life emotionally more I want to be objectively correct rather than anything else. You see, really, it's just two ways. There's really two methods. Eliminate, make everything cold and objective, or make the bias to be objectively true a powerful emotional effect. And you could do that either on a specific problem, or you can gear your whole life to be one of these two ways, or both of them. And therefore, the people who do the third and the fourth method will naturally find it much easier to get the objective truth when the question comes in front of them, either because they love truth or because they know how to be disciplined into focusing on what is objectively true in the first place, because that's how the mind works. Okay, I hope that was helpful. In summary, we need to know the truth, because the truth is everything. And how do we know truth? We need evidence for any belief system, whether it's religion or atheism, or which religion. Otherwise, we are in danger of being wrong based on what society tells us, what our upbringing has told us. That can have dire consequences. That's important. The consequences of being objectively wrong are disastrous. So therefore, it's important to know the truth, the objective truth. And the only way we can know truth is evidence. And there's a whole spectrum of types of evidence. And each type of evidence you're going to have to weigh up objectively as best you can. Demand as much evidence as possible to be more sure of the truth. But ultimately, in these questions of the truth of reality, the stakes are so high that you've got to go with a 51 over the 49%. If something tells you this is slightly more likely to be the truth than this one, you've got to go with that way. And before you start, you have to know what is weighing up the evidence. It's your da'as, your mind, that aspect of your self-awareness where you integrate all your information and make it a reality, and you can weigh it up in this part of your mind, which is essentially you. It is you who's weighing it up. But be very careful, because you can be influenced by the heart, the emotions. We spoke about this before, about the mind, the heart, and the body. The mind, that's hopefully the tool of objective truth, but the emotions and bias can sway it and skew it and completely distort it and corrupt it, absolutely, even with many people. So before you start, you have to be aware of your biases, try to identify them the best you can, and then eliminate them the best you can, right? And use these methods of trying to eliminate bias. And then you can go and coldly analyze the different pieces of evidence, weigh it up with hopefully your unsullied, with your pure, unaffected by bias mind. Make the judgment in the direction where objectively the evidence is pushing, without having the biases giving more weight than they should to certain pieces of evidence. And then we come on to the evidence itself, which is going to hopefully be the next few lectures. I'm not sure how long I want to make this series. I could really make this series at least 20, maybe 50, even 100 or more lectures of different types of evidence, and different types of category of evidence. Each category of evidence has got many examples. For example, one just as an example off the top of my head, what's a good example to bring here? You've got the sort of a scientific evidence of God. That means you look at the probability of the world being the way it is, if it was purely random or if it was designed, the evidence of design. So that's one category, evidence of God by the design. And there's hundreds of different examples where you can see from the design, from the way that the universe works, that it's been designed by an intelligence being, rather than it's come into that as a result of random reactions and interactions of other things. Yeah. So there's many of categories, and within each category you have many examples. Okay. So hopefully this series we'll see how it goes. We'll play it by ear, and there's a few which are very important, which are very convincing, and there's some categories which each person will find more convincing than the others, but there's certain ones which I think are very convincing, and we'll try focusing on those ones up front. Thanks for listening to this. Hopefully you got a lot out of this. This is such an important lecture. I've been working on this one for a long time, so hopefully I've got over the ideas very clearly. And the importance of truth, that's what essentially this lecture has been about. Truth is everything, and we have to be aware of ourselves and how vulnerable we are in not getting the truth right, despite the fact that we think we're right. We have to know our biases, and we have to have a clear approach onto how to start analyzing evidence, but we have to come to that without biases the best we can beforehand. Otherwise, we've failed before we've even started. Thanks for listening, everyone. I hope you enjoyed that, and hopefully we'll see you in the next following series of lectures where we'll actually get into the nitty-gritty of actual proofs. Thanks for listening, everyone, and see you in the next few videos, hopefully. All the best.